Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The world Rome built before it fell. You are living in a world that feels finished. Not finished in the sense of being complete or exhausted, but finished in the way a stone road feels finished beneath your feet. Solid, reliable, certain. When you wake in the morning somewhere in the Western Roman Empire, in Italy, Gaul, Hispania, or Africa, you expect the same structures to be there tomorrow. Roads will still lead where they always have. Officials will still collect taxes. Markets will still open. The law, however imperfectly enforced, will still exist as a shared idea. This feeling of permanence is perhaps Rome's greatest and most dangerous achievement. The Western Roman Empire at its height is not just a collection of territories ruled by force. It is a system that quietly organizes daily life. It tells you how long a mile is. It tells you when courts meet. It tells you how contracts are written and how disputes are resolved. Even if you never see an emperor, you feel his presence in weights, measures, calendars, and coins. Rome does not need to remind you constantly that it rules. It simply assumes it. By the 4th century, this assumption has existed for generations. No living person remembers a world without Roman authority. Even the oldest citizens grew up under an empire that already felt ancient. Temples, forums, aqueducts, and bathhouses were old before they were born. The idea that any of it might vanish does not often cross the mind. You walk on roads laid down centuries earlier, still carefully cambered so rainwater runs off to the sides. Mile markers tell you exactly how far you are from Rome, even if Rome itself feels distant and symbolic rather than immediate. These roads are maintained by local labor and imperial expectation. They are not glamorous, but they are dependable, and dependability shapes how people think about the future. Cities across the Western Empire share a familiar shape. There is a forum, a basilica for legal business, public baths, temples or churches, storehouses, and administrative offices. Even smaller towns imitate the pattern on a reduced scale. This uniformity creates comfort. If you travel, you already know how the next city works. You know where to go to register a complaint or pay a fee. You know how markets function and what coins will be accepted. Rome's bureaucracy is not fast, but it is thorough. Documents are copied. Records are kept. Census data is collected, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes inaccurately, but persistently. Taxes are assessed in grain, coin, labor, and obligation. You may dislike the tax collector, but you understand him. His role has existed longer than your family memory. What makes this world feel especially stable is that it survived crises before. Plagues came and went. Emperors were assassinated. Borders shifted, civil wars erupted, yet afterward the empire remained. Administrators returned to their desks. Soldiers rebuilt forts. Governors resumed correspondence. For centuries, Rome absorbed shocks without losing its underlying structure. This history of survival quietly teaches everyone that Rome is not fragile. Even when the empire splits administratively between East and West, this does not feel like a fracture. It feels practical. Too large to manage from one place, the empire adapts. Constantinople thrives in the east. Rome, Milan, and Ravenna serve the west. The system bends without breaking. At least, that is how it appears. For ordinary people, daily life continues along predictable lines. Farmers worry about harvests more than invasions. Artisans worry about supply chains more than imperial politics. Parents worry about illness, dowries, and inheritance. Empire exists in the background, shaping possibilities without demanding constant attention. Soldiers along the frontiers patrol familiar boundaries. Many are local men, not strangers from distant lands. Forts become small communities with families, traders, and craftsmen clustering nearby. Military life becomes routine rather than heroic. Defense is a job, not a drama. This is important because routine dulls awareness. The Western Empire's borders are long, complex, and porous. Rivers like the Rhine and Danube are not walls but managed zones. Trade crosses them. Diplomacy crosses them. People cross them. Rome has always negotiated with neighboring groups, absorbing some, fighting others, employing many. This is not new and therefore not alarming. Barbarian is a Roman word, not a self-description. It means foreigner, not necessarily enemy. Many so-called barbarians already live within the empire, serving in the army, farming land, paying taxes, and worshiping Roman gods or the Christian God. The distinction between Roman and non-Roman is increasingly legal rather than cultural. Citizenship, once exclusive, has been expanded repeatedly until it covers nearly everyone freeborn within imperial borders. This act, meant to unify the empire, also quietly changes what it means to be Roman. Identity becomes diffuse. Loyalty becomes layered, to family, town, region, and empire in that order. None of this feels urgent. None of it feels dangerous. From your perspective, the empire's problems seem manageable because they have always been manageable. When officials complain about corruption, they are echoing complaints made generations earlier. When generals request more funding, they are repeating an ancient refrain. When emperors issue reforms, they resemble countless reforms before them. Even inflation, which erodes the value of coinage over time, feels like an annoyance rather than a threat. Prices rise, coins change, people adapt. Rome has debased its currency before and survived. Why would this time be different? The built environment reinforces confidence. Aqueducts still bring water from distant hills. Bathhouses still open daily. Grain still arrives from North Africa. Ships still cross the Mediterranean with predictable regularity. Rome's infrastructure is so vast that it masks decline simply by continuing to function. Maintenance becomes less visible than construction. Repairs are postponed, then quietly forgotten. Tiles are replaced with wood. Roads are patched instead of rebuilt. These changes are small enough to be rationalized. After all, nothing truly essential has failed yet. What makes the coming collapse difficult to see is that it does not begin with a single disaster. It begins with subtle adjustments. Officials take shortcuts. Positions go unfilled. Responsibilities shift from central authority to local elites. The empire does not announce these changes. It absorbs them silently. From inside the system, you experience continuity. From a distance, historians will later see fragmentation. But you do not live from a distance. You live inside the rhythm of the empire, the taxes, the markets, the festivals, the seasons. You assume tomorrow will resemble today because it always has. Rome, after all, has been here longer than memory, longer than myth feels reliable, longer than imagination allows you to picture its absence. And so the world continues, solid and unquestioned, even as the foundations beneath it begin to change in ways that are almost too ordinary to notice, raising a quiet question that no one yet knows how to ask. If an empire has survived every previous crisis, how would anyone recognize the moment when survival is no longer guaranteed? If you look closely enough, you begin to notice that Rome's strength does not come from emperors or armies alone. It comes from paperwork. The empire is held together by records, expectations, and habits repeated so often that they feel natural. Orders move along established routes. Tax quotas are copied from earlier years. Legal formulas are reused with minor adjustments. What Rome truly governs is not territory, but process. From your place inside the Western Roman Empire, this machinery feels dependable precisely because it is boring. The imperial government does not micromanage daily life. Instead, it delegates relentlessly. Local elites, landowners, city councilors, magistrates are responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining infrastructure, and enforcing imperial law. These men are not necessarily enthusiastic, but participation is mandatory. Civic duty is not optional in Roman political culture. It is an obligation tied to status. For centuries, this arrangement works. Wealthy locals gain prestige. The empire gains labor and stability. Everyone understands the bargain. But by the 4th century, the bargain is quietly becoming unbalanced. Serving on a city council, once an honor, now comes with financial risk. Councilors are personally responsible for shortfalls in tax collection. If harvests fail or citizens flee, the burden does not disappear, it transfers upward. The empire's need for revenue does not shrink when circumstances worsen. It hardens. So local elites begin to look for ways out. Some seek exemptions through imperial favor. Others abandon cities altogether, retreating to rural estates where obligations are easier to avoid. A few attempt to pass responsibilities to their heirs, tying families to civic roles they no longer want. The system still functions, but with growing resentment embedded inside it. From your perspective as an ordinary inhabitant, you may not see these negotiations. What you notice instead are subtle delays. Repairs take longer. Officials seem distracted or absent. Appeals move slowly. None of this feels catastrophic. It feels like inefficiency, something Rome has always had. The imperial army, too, relies on systems rather than inspiration. Recruitment, pay, supply chains, and command structures are standardized. Soldiers expect rations, wages, and discharge benefits. When these arrive late or incomplete, morale declines quietly rather than explosively. The Western Empire's military is still formidable, but it is increasingly defensive. Fortifications multiply. Garrisons settle in place. Mobility decreases. Campaigns are planned cautiously. Generals are careful not to overextend resources that are harder to replace than they once were. This caution is rational. It is also limiting. Along the frontiers, treaties with neighboring peoples become more common than conquest. Rome grants land in exchange for service, food in exchange for peace, titles in exchange for loyalty. These agreements are practical solutions to manpower shortages and logistical strain. They are not signs of weakness so much as adaptation. Yet adaptation has consequences. Groups settled within the empire often remain socially distinct. They answer to their own leaders even while serving Roman interests. Over time, loyalty becomes conditional rather than assumed. Rome is no longer the unquestioned center of authority, but one power among several that must negotiate. Inside the cities, economic life continues, though unevenly. Long-distance trade still exists, but it becomes more fragile. Disruptions ripple outward more noticeably. A delayed shipment of grain affects prices. A failed convoy means shortages. Markets remain open, but they feel more sensitive to forces beyond local control. Coinage reflects this tension. New coins circulate alongside older ones of varying purity. People weigh and test currency more carefully. Trust shifts subtly from imperial symbols to personal relationships. Barter increases in some areas, not because money disappears, but because reliability matters more than official value. Religion, too, is changing the texture of life. Christianity, once persecuted, is now favored and eventually dominant. Churches replace temples. Bishops gain influence. Moral authority begins to sit alongside, and sometimes above, imperial authority. For many, this shift provides comfort and community. For the empire, it introduces another layer of loyalty that does not always align neatly with administrative needs. Yet even this change feels orderly. Laws are passed, councils are convened, doctrines are debated. Rome absorbs the transformation rather than resisting it outright. From inside the moment, it looks like evolution, not disruption. The emperor himself feels distant. He issues edicts, appoints officials, and appears in ceremonial contexts, but he is no longer the omnipresent figure of earlier centuries. Power is fragmented by necessity. Generals, governors, and court officials wield significant autonomy. Coordination becomes harder, though no one admits it openly. Communication slows. Messages still travel, but response times stretch. Decisions made in Ravenna or Milan arrive late in Britain or Gaul. Local authorities improvise, filling gaps left by delayed instructions. Improvisation becomes routine. And routines, once established, persist. This is perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the Western Empire's decline. Nothing forces an immediate reckoning. Each problem has a workaround. Each failure has an explanation. Each adjustment seems reasonable on its own. From your daily vantage point, life remains recognizable. You still wake, work, trade, worship, and sleep under the assumption that the empire endures. Even when you hear rumors of border troubles, of mutinies, of emperors rising and falling, they sound like echoes of the past, not warnings of something new. Rome has always survived instability. Why should now be different? Yet beneath the calm surface, the machinery is grinding harder to produce the same results. More effort yields less certainty. More control requires more delegation. The empire does not collapse in this moment, it stretches. And stretched systems do not announce when they are close to tearing. As you move through this world, surrounded by familiar institutions that still function just well enough, you are left with a quiet uncertainty that few can articulate. If Rome continues to adapt without ever truly recovering, at what point does adaptation become surrender rather than survival? From where you stand, nothing has collapsed. That is the final and most disorienting truth of the Western Roman Empire's early decline. It does not announce itself. There is no moment when the streets empty, no single decree that signals the end of the world you know. Instead, life continues, and it is this continuation that disguises the transformation already underway. You still pay taxes. You still recognize imperial authority. You still think of yourself as living in the empire, not after it. But the meaning of those things has begun to change. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Western Empire is increasingly reactive rather than directive. Events shape policy more often than policy shapes events. Emperors respond to crises as they arise, rarely with the resources or time needed for lasting solutions. Stability becomes a matter of postponement. You might notice this first in matters of security. The army is present but thinner. Units that once rotated regularly now stay in place for years. Veterans settle near forts, marrying local women and farming land granted in lieu of pay. Soldiers become semi-permanent fixtures of regional life rather than mobile instruments of imperial will. This makes sense to everyone involved. It reduces costs, it stabilizes frontiers, it keeps men fed. It also means that military loyalty slowly shifts from abstract imperial authority to immediate commanders, families, and local interests. Rome's army is no longer a single, unified force so much as a collection of regional solutions. When threats emerge, responses are uneven. Some areas mobilize quickly, others wait. Coordination suffers not because anyone refuses orders, but because no one is certain who has the authority to issue them. The same pattern appears in civilian administration. City councils still exist, but many struggle to function. Membership declines as obligations grow heavier and benefits diminish. Wealthy families invest less in public buildings and more in private estates. Civic pride erodes, replaced by personal security strategies. Public spaces remain in use, but maintenance becomes selective. A bathhouse closes 2 days a week instead of 1. A road is narrowed where paving stones go missing. A roof leaks longer before repair. These details are small enough to ignore until they accumulate. The empire increasingly relies on individuals to fill institutional gaps. Bishops negotiate with invaders. Landowners organize local defense. Military commanders distribute food during shortages. None of this is revolutionary. Rome has always depended on local initiative. What changes is the frequency with which local solutions replace imperial ones entirely. You may still hear the language of unity, the Roman people, the Roman world, the eternal empire, but language has begun to outpace reality. This becomes painfully clear during moments of crisis. When groups cross imperial borders in large numbers, not as raiders, but as migrants seeking land and safety, Rome responds with familiar tools: treaties, settlements, service agreements. On paper, these preserve order. In practice, they introduce new power centers inside imperial territory. Settled groups often govern themselves internally. Roman officials oversee them nominally, but day-to-day authority rests elsewhere. Over time, the distinction between Roman land and allied land blurs. Maps remain the same. Control does not. Yet even now, from your perspective, Rome still exists. Coins are still minted. Laws are still issued. Emperors are still named. The calendar still counts years by consuls and reigns. These symbols matter because they provide continuity, and continuity feels like survival. But continuity can be deceptive. The empire no longer has the capacity to enforce its will consistently across its territory. Instead, it negotiates outcomes. It persuades, compromises, and adapts. Power becomes situational. This does not feel like failure. It feels like maturity, like a system that has learned to be flexible. And flexibility keeps the illusion alive. If you are a farmer, you care less about imperial coherence than about whether your land is protected and your harvest collected. If a local authority provides that stability, you accept it, regardless of whether it answers directly to Rome. Survival reshapes loyalty. If you are a merchant, you follow safe routes and reliable partners. If imperial roads are unsafe but local arrangements ensure passage, you adapt. Commerce does not stop, it reroutes. If you are an official, you reinterpret your role. Instead of enforcing distant edicts rigidly, you prioritize what can realistically be done. This pragmatism keeps communities functioning even as the larger structure weakens. From a distance, historians will describe this period as decline. From inside it, you experience something closer to decentralization. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is that Rome's greatest strengths delay recognition of its vulnerability. The empire's legal culture, administrative habits, and infrastructural legacy continue to operate long after central authority can no longer sustain them fully. Rome casts a long shadow, and people continue to live in it even as the sun moves on. Eventually, the moment comes when an emperor in the West is removed without replacement, when imperial authority fades from a region without immediate resistance, when people stop waiting for orders that never arrive. But even then, life goes on. Fields are planted, disputes are settled, children are born into a world that still uses Roman measurements, Roman words, Roman law without necessarily answering to Rome itself. This is the final transformation of the Western Roman Empire. It does not end in silence or fire, but in inheritance. Its systems outlive its institutions. Its habits outlast its rulers. From your position inside history, you might not realize that you are living through the end of an empire. You might think you are simply adapting to another phase of it. And perhaps that is the most unsettling realization of all. If an empire can disappear without most people noticing the exact moment it does, how many other endings in history passed not as collapses, but as quiet continuations under a different name? Story 2. The quiet cracks in Roman administration. You rarely see the empire at work. Most days, Roman administration is invisible, a background hum rather than a spectacle. It appears in forms and fees, in schedules and expectations, in obligations inherited rather than chosen. It is not designed to inspire you. It is designed to function. And for a very long time it does. The Western Roman Empire governs not through constant force, but through predictability. Officials know what they are expected to collect. Communities know what they are expected to provide. The system relies on memory as much as authority, on the idea that this is how things have always been done. But beneath that familiarity, pressure is building. Administration in the late empire is heavy, layered, and demanding. Every reform intended to improve efficiency adds another rule, another office, another exception. What begins as order slowly becomes density. The machinery grows more complex even as the resources supporting it begin to thin. From your place within this world, you experience governance not as ideology, but as obligation. If you live in a town, you are tied to it legally. Your profession may be hereditary. Bakers must bake. Shipowners must ship. Tax collectors must collect. These roles are enforced because the empire depends on them. Flexibility decreases as necessity increases. What once felt like civic pride now feels like confinement. City councils, the backbone of local administration, are expected to ensure tax quotas are met regardless of circumstances. Flood, drought, invasion, or depopulation do not reduce imperial expectations. Shortfalls must be made up by those responsible. This is where the cracks begin to form. Wealthy families who once competed for civic office now avoid it. Serving the city is no longer a path to honor but a liability. Holding office can ruin a household. Obligations outlast terms. Responsibilities transfer to heirs. So people resist quietly. Some underreport assets. Some delay payments. Some leverage connections to secure exemptions. Others simply leave. They abandon cities for rural estates where imperial oversight is weaker and obligations easier to evade. From the outside, cities still stand. From the inside, they hollow. The empire responds not by reducing demands, but by tightening control. Laws bind people more firmly to professions and locations. Movement becomes restricted. Records are updated more aggressively. Enforcement increases, but enforcement itself requires manpower and money, both of which are increasingly scarce. This creates a feedback loop. The harder the empire pushes, the more people withdraw. The more people withdraw, the harder the empire must push. To you, this may appear as frustration rather than collapse. Officials seem harsher. Procedures feel rigid. Compassion gives way to calculation. The state feels less like a shared project and more like an extractor of resources. Yet the extraction continues because it must. The Western Empire still needs to fund armies, courts, and logistics. Grain must be moved. Roads must be maintained. Soldiers must be fed. There is no alternative system waiting to replace this one. So the burden shifts downward. Local officials shoulder responsibilities once handled by higher authorities. Communities organize their own defenses. Landowners take on quasi-governmental roles, mediating disputes and enforcing order on their estates. These actions keep society functioning, but they also reduce reliance on imperial structures. Slowly, administration becomes personal. Where once you dealt with an office, now you deal with a person. Where once rules were applied uniformly, now they depend on relationships. Influence matters more than law. Proximity matters more than procedure. This is not chaos, it is adaptation. But adaptation changes expectations. If a local patron can protect you better than a distant governor, loyalty shifts naturally. If a bishop resolves disputes faster than a magistrate, authority follows effectiveness. The empire's legitimacy erodes not through rebellion, but through comparison. What Rome offers still exists, but alternatives are emerging. The imperial center senses this loss of control, even if it cannot fully articulate it. Edicts emphasize unity. Laws threaten penalties. Reforms are announced with confidence. But these measures increasingly feel aspirational rather than enforceable. Communication delays compound the problem. Orders arrive late. Conditions have already changed. Local officials improvise, then retroactively justify their decisions. The empire becomes reactive even in its administration. For you, daily life becomes more complicated. You keep more records. You seek more guarantees. You rely more on networks of trust. You learn which officials are flexible and which are dangerous. Survival depends less on understanding the law than on understanding people. Still, nothing has collapsed. Courts still convene. Taxes are still assessed. Titles are still granted. The administrative framework remains intact enough to give the impression of strength. Rome continues to govern, but it governs with diminishing leverage. The most striking aspect of this transformation is how little drama accompanies it. There are no proclamations announcing administrative failure, no ceremonies marking the end of effective governance. Instead, there is paperwork, endless, imperfect paperwork. Mistakes accumulate, records go uncorrected, roles overlap, authority blurs. The system grows heavier at precisely the moment it needs to become lighter. And yet, from inside the empire, you may still believe this is temporary, that another reform will fix it, that another emperor will restore balance, that Rome has endured worse. After all, Rome has always been bureaucratic. It has always been demanding. It has always adapted. So you endure. You adjust. You comply when necessary and avoid attention when possible. And somewhere beneath all of this administrative strain, a quiet question begins to form, not spoken aloud, but felt in daily calculations. If the empire requires more from its people each year just to remain the same, how long can obligation outweigh belief? As the years pass, you begin to sense that laws no longer land the way they once did. They still arrive written, stamped, proclaimed, but their weight feels uneven. Some are enforced strictly, others barely at all. The difference does not lie in importance but in practicality. What can be enforced is. What cannot be enforced quietly fades into suggestion. This is how Roman administration begins to lose its reach without losing its voice. Imperial law in the Western Empire has grown vast. Centuries of rulings, precedents, and reforms pile atop one another. New edicts rarely replace old ones. They clarify, amend, or exempt. The result is a legal landscape that requires expertise to navigate expertise increasingly rare outside major centers. For you, this means uncertainty. You may know the rule, but not whether it will be applied. You may follow the law and still lose to someone better connected. Justice, once predictable if not always fair, becomes situational. Officials face the same problem. Governors and magistrates are expected to uphold imperial law while managing local realities that make full enforcement impossible. If they apply the law rigidly, unrest follows. If they bend it, they risk punishment from above. Many choose a middle path, selective enforcement paired with plausible deniability. This creates space for discretion, and discretion creates inequality. Those with influence, wealth, or connections find ways through the system. Those without learn to avoid it. Over time, participation in imperial administration becomes something people endure rather than trust. The empire does not lack rules, it lacks capacity. Positions go unfilled. Offices exist in name only. A governor may be responsible for a territory too large to inspect regularly. Inspectors may lack escorts. Messengers may be delayed or intercepted. Each weak link slows the entire chain. And yet the paperwork continues. Reports are written describing conditions that no longer exist by the time they are read. Tax assessments assume populations that have moved or died. Military rosters list units that are under strength or merged informally with others. On parchment, the empire remains whole. On the ground, it fragments. This gap between record and reality grows wider with each passing decade. In response, the imperial center attempts to assert clarity. Laws become more detailed. Penalties become harsher. Obligations become hereditary, binding families permanently to roles the empire needs filled. This is meant to stabilize the system. Instead, it signals desperation. When choice disappears, compliance follows only as long as enforcement remains credible. As enforcement weakens, people look for ways out legally, socially, geographically. Flight becomes common enough to be remarked upon in law. Peasants flee tax collectors. Counselors flee civic duty. Entire communities drift toward the protection of powerful patrons who can shield them from imperial demands. This patronage is not new. What changes is scale. Large landowners begin to function as miniature governments. They collect rents, enforce order, adjudicate disputes, and negotiate with officials. In return, those under their protection offer labor and loyalty. For the people involved, this arrangement is practical. It reduces exposure to arbitrary enforcement. It offers immediate protection. It feels personal rather than abstract. For the empire, it is a quiet loss of authority. Taxes collected through patrons are less predictable. Loyalty flows around the state rather than through it. Power becomes localized without ever declaring independence. You may still call yourself Roman, but Rome is no longer the primary actor in your daily survival. Even within the administrative class, priorities shift. Officials focus on preserving their positions rather than improving systems. Short-term stability matters more than long-term reform. No one wants to be responsible for change that might fail. So inertia sets in. The empire continues to issue laws for problems it no longer has the tools to solve. Corruption is condemned, but enforcement is sporadic. Absenteeism is punished, but positions remain undesirable. Efficiency is demanded, but resources continue to shrink. From your perspective, governance feels louder and less effective at the same time. Proclamations multiply, reality resists. This mismatch affects morale. Faith in the system erodes not through ideology, but through exhaustion. People comply because resistance is risky, not because compliance feels meaningful. Yet the system still works just enough. Grain still moves, armies still march, courts still hear cases. Administration persists in a diminished but recognizable form. This partial success is what makes the decline so difficult to confront. Rome is not failing completely. It is failing unevenly. Some regions remain well governed. Others are barely supervised. Some officials are competent and fair. Others are overwhelmed or self-serving. The empire becomes a patchwork of effectiveness. And patchworks do not collapse all at once. They fray at the edges. You might hear of places where imperial authority is barely felt. Britain grows distant. Parts of Gaul rely more on local defense than imperial troops. Spain feels slower, quieter. Italy itself becomes politically cautious, more ceremonial than commanding. None of this feels like the end. It feels like distance. Distance between law and life, between order and enforcement, between Rome as idea and Rome as power. You adapt as everyone does. You learn which rules matter. You learn when silence is safer than protest. You learn to rely on people rather than institutions. And still, the empire endures not because it is strong, but because it is familiar. Familiar systems are hard to abandon, even when they no longer function well. Yet beneath that familiarity, a subtle transformation is underway. Governance is no longer something you expect to be consistent. It is something you manage around. And once that expectation changes, something fundamental has already been lost. So the question lingers quietly beneath daily routines, unspoken but increasingly unavoidable. If laws continue to exist but no longer shape behavior evenly, at what point does an empire become a collection of habits rather than a governing power? There is no announcement when Roman administration stops trying to control everything. Instead, it learns slowly, reluctantly to let go. From your position within the Western Roman Empire, this shift feels less like surrender and more like fatigue. The state does not vanish. It simply stops insisting on outcomes it can no longer guarantee. Expectations soften. Enforcement becomes selective. What matters is no longer whether the law is perfectly applied, but whether order of some kind is maintained. This is not philosophy, it is survival. By the early 5th century, imperial administrators increasingly focus on preserving what still works rather than restoring what has already slipped away. Effort is concentrated on key regions, critical supply routes, and symbolic centers. Peripheral areas receive less attention, not because they are unimportant, but because resources cannot stretch everywhere at once. From the center, this is triage. From the edges, it feels like abandonment. If you live far from the imperial court, you may notice that officials visit less often. Messages arrive irregularly. Decisions are deferred. You are told to manage as best you can until further notice that may never come. Local solutions become normalized. Town leaders negotiate directly with nearby military commanders. Bishops arbitrate disputes once handled by magistrates. Landowners assume responsibility for roads, bridges, and security within their domains. These arrangements are informal at first, justified as temporary measures. Temporary measures have a way of becoming permanent. The empire does not object loudly because it cannot. To interfere would require resources it no longer possesses. Instead, it retroactively approves what it would once have prevented. Titles are granted to local strongmen. Agreements are recognized after the fact. Authority follows effectiveness rather than the other way around. From your perspective, this makes life simpler and more complicated at the same time. Simpler because decisions are made nearby. You know who to appeal to. You understand the limits of their power. You no longer wait months for a distant response. More complicated because consistency disappears. What is permitted in one region may be forbidden in another. Taxes vary. Obligations differ. Justice depends on relationships rather than statutes. This unevenness becomes the defining feature of late Western Roman administration. The empire still exists as an idea, a shared language of law, status, and identity, but it no longer dictates uniform experience. Being Roman now means something different depending on where you live. In some places, imperial systems remain relatively intact. In others, they are little more than memory and terminology layered over new realities. Importantly, this transition is not driven by mass rebellion. Most people do not rise up against Roman administration. They simply stop relying on it. Resistance is passive, adaptive, and deeply practical. People choose arrangements that work, regardless of their origin. This quiet withdrawal is more damaging than open revolt. Rebellions can be crushed. Withdrawals leave nothing to confront. Imperial officials are not blind to this. Many are acutely aware of the limits of their authority. Their correspondence reflects anxiety, frustration, and resignation. They speak of ideals they can no longer enforce and responsibilities they can no longer fulfill. Some adapt by becoming intermediaries rather than rulers. They broker compromises. They manage decline. They preserve dignity where power has faded. Others retreat into ceremony. Titles multiply. Honors are granted. Court rituals grow elaborate. Symbolic continuity becomes more important as practical control diminishes. The empire performs itself, reaffirming its identity even as its influence narrows. From inside the system, this feels like preservation. From outside, it looks like hollowing. What remains remarkably intact is the administrative mindset itself. Even as control weakens, Roman ways of thinking endure. Records are kept. Contracts are written. Disputes are argued in Roman legal terms. Time is still measured by Roman calendars. This persistence matters. When imperial authority fades in a region, it does not leave chaos behind. It leaves habits. These habits shape whatever comes next. New rulers adopt Roman titles. Local leaders use Roman law. Administrative continuity outlives political unity. In this sense, the Western Roman Empire does not so much collapse administratively as dissolve into its components. Each component continues independently. For you living through this transition, the change feels gradual enough to be survivable. You adjust expectations. You redefine loyalty. You focus on immediate stability rather than distant ideals. You may still speak of Rome with respect. You may still hope for restoration, but you no longer depend on it. And dependence is the true measure of power. By the time the Western imperial court itself disappears, much of its administrative role has already been redistributed. Communities are used to governing themselves. Patrons are used to providing protection. Bishops are used to mediating authority. Soldiers are used to serving local interests. The empire's final administrative act is not a decree, but an absence. No replacement arrives. And yet life continues. Fields are worked, laws are cited, disputes are settled, children learn to read and write in Roman terms. The machinery of governance, once centralized, now runs on memory and habit rather than command. This is the legacy of Roman administration in the West. Not a broken system, but a system that taught others how to function without it. From the future, this will be called collapse. From inside the moment, it feels like adjustment stretched across generations. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all is this. An empire does not need to fall violently to end. It can simply become unnecessary. So as Roman administration quietly steps back, leaving behind forms, language, and expectations, one final question lingers not as an accusation, but as a reflection on power itself. If people learn how to live without an empire long before it officially disappears, when does its end truly begin? Story 3. Soldiers, borders, and the long goodbye to discipline. You have grown up knowing that Rome is protected. Not because you have seen its armies in constant motion, but because you have learned to trust that they are there. Somewhere along the rivers, behind the walls, beyond the hills. The army is not a daily presence in your life. It is a guarantee that allows daily life to proceed without constant fear. This is how Roman military power is meant to feel: distant, reliable, unquestioned. For centuries, the Western Roman army is less a tool of conquest than a framework of stability. It patrols borders, deters raids, escorts officials, and reassures populations simply by existing. Its strength lies not only in weapons or numbers, but in organization and discipline, habits reinforced over generations. But discipline, like administration, depends on belief. By the late 4th century, the Roman army in the West is still large, still structured, still dangerous. What has begun to change is how it is used, how it is supplied, and how it understands itself. You might notice first that soldiers no longer pass through your region as often as they once did. Units that previously rotated between postings now remain in place. Forts become semi-permanent homes rather than temporary stations. Soldiers farm nearby land, raise families, and integrate into local economies. Military service begins to resemble settlement rather than movement. This is not decay, it is policy. The empire faces persistent manpower shortages. Recruiting Roman citizens becomes harder as obligations grow and incentives weaken. Service is long. Pay is unreliable. Risks are high. The army adapts by settling soldiers where they are needed most, tying them to land and community. From the empire's perspective, this makes sense. Stationary troops cost less to move and supply. They know the terrain. They develop relationships with local populations. From a military perspective, something subtle is lost. Armies that do not march forget how to march. Training continues but unevenly. Standards vary by region and commander. Some units remain disciplined and effective. Others become complacent, focused more on local concerns than imperial readiness. The Roman army has always relied on hierarchy and routine. Orders flow downward. Discipline flows upward. When supply chains weaken and communication slows, this flow is disrupted. Pay arrives late. Equipment is reused beyond its lifespan. Armor is repaired rather than replaced. Weapons vary in quality. None of this renders soldiers useless, but it changes how they fight and why. Service becomes less about Rome and more about survival. You may hear soldiers complain openly about corrupt officers, about missing rations, about promises unkept. This too is not new. Roman soldiers have always complained. What is new is that complaints increasingly go unanswered. Commanders, themselves under pressure, prioritize keeping units loyal over enforcing strict discipline. Leniency becomes a tool. Personal loyalty matters more than adherence to abstract standards. The army becomes more personal, more localized. Along the borders, Rome's relationship with neighboring peoples changes accordingly. Instead of relying solely on Roman troops, the empire increasingly incorporates non-Roman soldiers, men, and entire groups who serve under their own leaders in exchange for land, food, or protection. These arrangements are formalized through treaties and oaths. They are not signs of desperation. They are pragmatic responses to demographic reality. But they alter the nature of the army. Units composed of allied groups fight effectively when their interests align with Rome. When they do not, loyalty becomes negotiable. Command becomes complicated. Cultural assumptions differ. Discipline means different things to different people. The Roman army becomes diverse in ways it has never been before linguistically, culturally, and structurally. From your perspective, this diversity may feel normal. After all, the empire itself is diverse. But military cohesion depends on shared expectations, and those expectations are increasingly difficult to maintain. Borders, too, change character. The Rhine and Danube are no longer rigid lines of exclusion. They are zones of interaction. Trade, diplomacy, migration, and military service all pass through them. Rome does not simply defend these borders, it manages them. Management requires negotiation. When pressures increase beyond the borders, environmental stress, political instability, population movement, Rome responds as it always has, by absorbing rather than excluding. Groups are settled inside the empire, assigned land, and expected to contribute militarily. These decisions are made to prevent violence. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they merely delay it. The army is then tasked not only with defense, but with supervision. Soldiers monitor settlements, enforce agreements, and intervene in disputes involving people who are technically inside the empire but not fully integrated into its structures. This blurs roles. Are soldiers defenders of Rome or mediators between competing communities? Are they agents of central authority or local enforcers maintaining fragile peace? The answer increasingly depends on location. In some regions, Roman military presence remains strong and cohesive. In others, authority is shared or contested. Soldiers must navigate political complexity alongside military duty. This requires flexibility, and flexibility erodes uniformity. You might still hear of great Roman victories. They happen. The army is not impotent, but victories are harder to sustain. Success requires coordination across regions that no longer operate in perfect sync. Defeats, when they occur, feel more consequential. Not because Rome has never lost battles before, but because recovery is slower. Replacements take time. Resources are limited. Public confidence wavers more easily when reassurance feels less convincing. And yet the army does not collapse. It adapts. It recruits differently. It settles differently. It fights differently. These adaptations keep it functional, but they also transform its identity. The Roman army of this period is no longer primarily an instrument of expansion or even deterrence. It is an instrument of containment, holding together a world that is pressing inward from all sides. Containment is exhausting. It requires constant vigilance without the promise of resolution. It demands endurance rather than glory. Soldiers serve longer, see less reward, and fight battles that do not change the overall situation. Over time, this changes motivation. Service becomes transactional, loyalty becomes conditional, identity becomes fragmented. Still, from your place within the empire, you trust that the army will respond when needed. That trust is based on habit rather than evidence, but habits are powerful. Rome has always had soldiers. Rome has always had borders. Rome has always managed threats. So you assume it always will. But somewhere along the quiet frontiers, as soldiers settle, negotiate, and adapt to a world where marching orders arrive late or not at all, the army begins to shift from being Rome's backbone to being one of many supports holding up a structure already under strain. And this raises a question that few are yet ready to confront. If an army exists primarily to preserve stability rather than project authority, how long can it defend an empire whose center is no longer fully in command? You begin to notice that soldiers talk differently than they once did. Not openly disloyal, not rebellious, just practical. Their concerns are immediate and concrete. Where their next rations will come from, whether their families are safe, which commander can actually protect them if things go wrong. Rome, as an abstract idea, still matters, but it no longer dominates conversation. Loyalty has not disappeared, it has been redistributed. In the earlier empire, a soldier's identity was bound tightly to the state. He swore an oath to the emperor, served in standardized units, and expected predictable rewards: pay, land, honor. The system was imperfect, but the promise was clear. By the early 5th century in the Western Empire, that promise has grown uncertain. Pay is often delayed. Bonuses are irregular. Veterans' benefits depend on local arrangements rather than imperial guarantee. A soldier's well-being increasingly depends on his immediate commander, not on distant authority. So loyalty follows proximity. Commanders who can secure food, land, or protection command devotion. Those who cannot struggle to maintain discipline. Enforcement becomes personal rather than institutional. Punishments are negotiated. Orders are discussed rather than assumed. This does not mean the army stops functioning. It means it functions differently. Discipline becomes flexible. Roman military discipline was once legendary, harsh, standardized, unforgiving. That reputation still exists, but its reality varies widely. Some units maintain strict order. Others tolerate informality as the price of cohesion. From the empire's perspective, cohesion matters more than uniformity. A loyal but imperfect unit is preferable to a mutinous one. Mutiny, after all, is no longer unthinkable. Soldiers are acutely aware of their leverage. They know the empire needs them more than ever. In some cases, units demand concessions. In others, they quietly ignore orders that conflict with local interests. The line between negotiation and insubordination grows thin. Borders reflect this shift. Fortifications are still manned, but their purpose changes. Instead of repelling all movement, they regulate it. Soldiers monitor crossings, collect tolls, escort groups, and enforce agreements with neighboring peoples. Defense becomes administration. This administrative role further blurs military identity. Soldiers spend as much time managing people as fighting them. Violence is a last resort, not because it is morally avoided, but because it is costly and destabilizing. When violence does occur, it often escalates unpredictably. Allied groups within the empire fight alongside Roman units, but coordination is imperfect. Communication barriers, differing tactics, and competing loyalties complicate operations. Success depends heavily on personal relationships between leaders. When those relationships hold, campaigns succeed. When they fracture, outcomes are disastrous. Defeats carry new weight because recovery is slower. The empire cannot easily replace lost units. Recruitment pools are strained. Training takes time. Equipment is scarce. Each loss weakens not just military capacity but public confidence. You may hear rumors of battles far away, not always clear, often contradictory. Victories are celebrated cautiously. Defeats are explained away. Information moves slowly and selectively. What you feel instead is uncertainty. The sense that the borders are no longer fixed, but elastic. That danger is not constant, but unpredictable. That safety depends increasingly on local arrangements rather than imperial might. This affects civilian behavior. Communities fortify themselves. Walls are repaired. Watch schedules are organized. Local militias supplement imperial troops. These measures are defensive, not rebellious. People are not rejecting Rome, they are compensating for its limits. The empire tolerates this because it must. To forbid local defense would be to accept vulnerability. To encourage it openly would be to admit weakness. So the practice exists in an ambiguous space, unofficial, accepted, necessary. Over time, ambiguity becomes normal. Soldiers, too, adapt psychologically. Service is no longer a path to upward mobility or honor in the same way it once was. It is a job, sometimes a burdensome one. Motivation shifts from pride to pragmatism. Yet many soldiers remain committed. They fight bravely. They endure hardship. The army does not disintegrate into apathy. What changes is the reason they fight. They fight for comrades, for commanders, for land, for families, for survival. Rome becomes one cause among many, not the defining one. This transformation is gradual enough to escape alarm. No single reform causes it. No single defeat triggers it. It emerges from accumulated adjustments, each sensible, each necessary. From inside the system, it feels like modernization. From outside, it looks like dilution. By the time imperial authorities recognize the extent of the shift, their ability to reverse it is limited. Attempts to reassert discipline often provoke resistance. Harsh enforcement risks mutiny. Leniency risks loss of control. There is no ideal solution. So the army continues forward, altered but intact, holding borders that no longer represent absolute limits, enforcing loyalty that no longer flows exclusively upward. And still Rome stands. But the meaning of Roman military power has changed. It is no longer a force that shapes the world decisively. It is a force that reacts, adapts, and contains. Containment buys time. It does not restore certainty. As you go about your life, hearing the distant presence of soldiers and the nearer presence of local defenses, a quiet realization begins to settle, not as fear, but as adjustment. If Rome's army now depends on local loyalties to function, what happens when those loyalties no longer point back to Rome at all? You eventually realize that the borders no longer feel distant. They are not far-off lines guarded by unseen legions. They are present in everyday life, in the movement of people, in the rumors carried by traders, in the soldiers who settle nearby and never leave. The frontier has come inward, not as an invasion, but as a condition of existence. By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire's military reality is no longer defined by clear separation between inside and outside. The borderlands are no longer edges. They are the empire itself. This is not a sudden change. It happens because the army has adapted to pressure by integrating it. Groups once kept beyond the frontiers now live within them. Soldiers once meant to move now remain in place. Military authority overlaps with civilian life. The distinction between defense and governance fades. From your perspective, this feels like normalization rather than crisis. You may see armed men more often, but they are familiar faces. They attend local gatherings. They own land. They speak local languages. They are part of the community as much as they are representatives of imperial power. This familiarity reduces fear. It also reduces distance. When soldiers are neighbors, their loyalty matters in ways that abstract allegiance does not. They protect what they know. They prioritize what they can see. Rome, as a distant authority, competes with immediate realities. The empire accepts this trade-off because it has few alternatives. Military commanders increasingly act as regional power brokers. They negotiate settlements, allocate land, enforce peace, and respond to threats. Their authority comes not from office alone, but from their ability to act. In many regions, the most effective government is the one closest to the troops. This concentration of power is tolerated because it produces results. Regions with strong military leadership remain stable longer. Regions without it struggle. From the imperial court, this looks like delegation. From the ground, it feels like replacement. The army's composition reflects this shift. Roman and non-Roman identities blur further. Service creates belonging. Commanders recruit where they can, drawing from local populations and allied groups. Uniformity matters less than effectiveness. The Roman army becomes Roman in function rather than in origin. Discipline persists, but it is adapted. Orders are contextual. Punishments are negotiated. Authority flows through relationships rather than rules. This flexibility allows survival. It also weakens central control. When large-scale crises occur, mass migrations, internal rebellions, rival claimants to imperial authority, the army responds unevenly. Some commanders act decisively. Others hesitate. Coordination across regions is inconsistent. The empire's military response becomes fragmented. Yet fragmentation does not equal collapse. In many places, life remains orderly. Trade continues. Agriculture persists. Local defense works well enough. The army succeeds in preventing total breakdown. This success, paradoxically, hastens transformation. Because things continue, there is no urgent push to restore centralized discipline. Because stability exists locally, the need for imperial intervention diminishes. The empire's role becomes symbolic rather than operational. By the time the Western imperial court loses its ability to command armies directly, much of that command has already migrated outward. When imperial authority finally fails in a region, it does so quietly. Soldiers do not disappear. They simply stop receiving orders from the center. They continue serving under local leaders who can meet their needs. The borderlands, once managed, now manage themselves. This is the final stage of Rome's military transformation in the West. The army does not abandon the empire abandons the idea of a single army. What remains are armed communities, experienced commanders, and inherited Roman practices. They form the backbone of successor kingdoms that will claim Roman legitimacy even as they replace Roman authority. From inside this moment, you might not feel like you are witnessing an ending. You might feel like you are watching Rome spread into the countryside, into local life, into new forms. The name persists, the symbols persist, the memory persists. What fades is command. The Western Roman Empire's military does not lose because it forgets how to fight. It loses because it forgets how to be centralized, and because decentralization, once embraced, cannot easily be undone. And so the army, once Rome's most visible expression of power, becomes the means by which Rome's power is redistributed. The soldiers remain, the forts remain, the discipline altered, adapted, compromised remains. What does not remain is the unquestioned authority that once bound them all together. As you move forward into a world where armed protection is local and loyalty is negotiated, one final question lingers over the quiet garrisons and settled troops of the former empire. If Rome's army survives by becoming something else, did it truly fail, or did it succeed in ensuring continuity at the cost of unity? Story 4. The daily life of Romans as stability faded. Most of your life is not shaped by emperors, borders, or armies. It is shaped by routine. You wake at roughly the same time each morning. You eat familiar food. You work the same land, practice the same trade, walk the same streets. You measure time by seasons, market days, religious festivals, and household obligations. Whatever is happening at the edges of the empire feels distant compared to the immediate demands of survival. This is why the fading of Roman stability is so difficult to perceive in the moment. It unfolds not through dramatic disruption, but through subtle changes in ordinary days. If you live in a town or city, you still recognize its shape. The forum remains the center of public life, even if fewer people linger there than before. Shops open as they always have. Artisans continue their work. Children play in familiar streets. The built environment, inherited from earlier centuries, lends an air of permanence to everything you do. Stone lasts longer than systems. Public buildings still stand, but they are used differently. A basilica meant for legal proceedings may now host religious gatherings more often than court cases. A bathhouse might open fewer hours or close sections to conserve fuel and water. Maintenance is selective. What is essential remains. What is decorative quietly fades. You notice this not as loss, but as adjustment. Water still flows through aqueducts in many regions, but pressure is lower. Repairs take longer. When pipes break, they are patched rather than replaced. The system works, just not as smoothly as before. You plan around it without complaint. Markets still operate, but supply feels less predictable. Some goods arrive irregularly. Prices fluctuate more noticeably. Long-distance imports become occasional luxuries rather than assumptions. Local products matter more. If you are a farmer, your world feels both unchanged and more fragile. You still plant and harvest according to the seasons. You still depend on weather, soil, and labor, but you are more conscious of risk. Taxes remain regardless of yield. Protection is not guaranteed. If trouble comes, help may arrive late or not at all. So you hedge. You store more grain if you can. You rely more heavily on family and neighbors. You cultivate relationships with landowners or patrons who can offer protection. Independence becomes less realistic than security. If you are an artisan or merchant, you notice that trust matters more than regulation. Contracts are still written, but enforcement depends on who stands behind them. You prefer dealing with people you know, even if it limits opportunity. If you are poor, the margin for error shrinks. Public assistance still exists in theory, but it is less reliable. Charity increasingly comes from churches rather than civic institutions. Bishops and religious communities organize aid, offering food, shelter, and mediation. Their presence becomes central to daily survival. Religion is no longer just ritual, it is infrastructure. Christianity, now dominant, shapes daily rhythms. Worship structures time. Moral language shapes expectations. Clergy become familiar figures in disputes and crises. For many, this provides comfort and stability in a world where imperial guarantees feel abstract. Pagan practices do not vanish overnight. They linger in habits, festivals, and private devotion, but public life increasingly reflects Christian norms. Temples fall into disuse or are repurposed. This transition is uneven but noticeable. From your perspective, it feels like a cultural shift rather than a political one. Home life becomes more inward-looking. Families rely on one another more heavily. Extended households become common. Generations live together out of necessity as much as tradition. Inheritance matters deeply. Land, tools, and skills are passed down carefully because replacement is uncertain. Marriage becomes more strategic. Alliances matter. Stability matters. Romantic ideals exist, but practicality often wins. Education changes as well. Formal schooling persists in some areas, but access narrows. Literacy remains valuable, but less widespread. Education shifts toward religious institutions, where reading and writing serve spiritual and administrative needs rather than civic advancement. This subtly changes what knowledge is preserved. Classical texts still exist, but fewer people engage with them regularly. Practical knowledge, farming techniques, legal formulas, liturgical practice becomes more important than rhetorical skill. Yet Roman habits endure. You still think in Roman terms. You use Roman measurements. You follow Roman law when possible. Even as institutions weaken, cultural memory remains strong. What fades first is expectation. You no longer assume that problems will be solved from above. You solve them locally. You adapt quickly. You lower horizons. This does not feel like despair. It feels like realism. You do not wake each day thinking the empire is ending. You wake thinking about food, work, weather, and safety. Stability, once ambient, now requires attention. You plan differently. You listen more carefully to rumors. You track movements of people and troops. You pay attention to who holds power nearby. You adjust loyalties quietly without drama. In some regions, life feels calmer than before. Less imperial interference, fewer officials, more autonomy. In others, insecurity grows. The experience is uneven, and this unevenness shapes perception. There is no single Roman daily life anymore. There are many. What unites them is adaptation. Even leisure changes. Public entertainments decline in scale and frequency. Games and spectacles are rarer. Gatherings shift toward religious festivals and local celebrations. Entertainment becomes participatory rather than provided. You notice fewer travelers passing through, fewer strangers. Movement still happens, but it feels purposeful rather than casual. Roads are used but less crowded. Travel carries more risk. None of this happens all at once. Years pass, decades pass. Children grow up knowing this version of Roman life as normal. They do not miss what they never experienced. Their sense of stability is calibrated differently. And that is perhaps the most important change of all. Stability does not disappear, it is redefined. Instead of being guaranteed by empire, it is constructed daily through relationships, routines, and local arrangements. This kind of stability is fragile, but it is real. From the outside, historians will describe decline. From inside, you experience narrowing horizons, shifting expectations, and quieter days. The world feels smaller, more immediate, more personal. And as you settle into these adapted routines, accepting uncertainty as part of life rather than an exception, a gentle but unsettling thought begins to take shape, not as panic, but as awareness. If daily life can continue, even adapt, without the full presence of an empire, what exactly did that empire once provide that can no longer be felt? By now, the ordinary days of Roman life carry with them a quiet awareness. Things are no longer as predictable as they once seemed. You wake to familiar sounds: the clatter of carts, the low murmur of neighbors, the calls of vendors opening their stalls. Yet the rhythms you once took for granted carry subtle irregularities. Water may arrive late. Grain shipments may be smaller. Roads may be damaged from a winter storm and left unrepaired longer than before. Nothing is catastrophic, but the small, persistent frictions add up. The city or village in which you live is a microcosm of adaptation. Counselors still exist, though their attendance and effectiveness vary. You may see magistrates in the forum, but their decisions are slower and often mediated by personal relationships rather than strict law. When disputes arise, outcomes depend as much on local influence as on precedent. Justice is still administered, but the process is more about negotiation than application. Markets remain central to life, yet their reliability is uneven. Merchants travel shorter distances. Exotic goods arrive less frequently, sometimes spoiled or damaged. Prices fluctuate based on local harvests, available labor, and the presence of nearby military units. You learn to judge which traders can be trusted and which might fail to deliver. You pay attention not only to goods, but to relationships with merchants, with patrons, with soldiers who ensure safe passage along key routes. Even routine professions are subtly affected. Bakers, potters, and blacksmiths continue their work, but supply lines are less certain. Clay may need to be sourced from farther away. Ovens may lack fuel some days. Tools wear down without easy replacement. You adapt by improvising, sharing resources, or relying on familial apprenticeships to maintain production. For farmers, life carries a persistent tension. You still sow, tend, and harvest your fields according to the rhythm of the seasons. Yet crop yields are now influenced not only by weather, but also by taxation, shifting local authority, and the presence of nearby groups who may demand protection or service. You hedge against these uncertainties by storing food, negotiating obligations, and maintaining networks of neighbors who can lend assistance in times of need. The household itself becomes a key unit of resilience. Extended families consolidate to pool labor and resources. Generations live together to ensure care for the young and old. Skills and knowledge are passed directly within the family, often more reliably than through formal schooling. Children learn early that survival depends on observation, adaptation, and strategic thinking rather than imperial guarantees. Religion increasingly permeates the practicalities of life. Christianity is now deeply embedded in many regions, offering both moral guidance and social structure. Bishops and priests often mediate disputes, distribute aid, and organize relief for shortages. Pagan practices persist, often privatized or blended with Christian traditions, but public life is increasingly shaped by ecclesiastical influence. Rituals mark time, organize community, and provide reassurance in a world where secular authority is less immediate. Even leisure and culture reflect adaptation. Public entertainment's games, theater, and large festivals decline in scale. Smaller, local gatherings replace them. Religious celebrations offer shared experience, continuity, and practical instruction. Storytelling, music, and games at the household level provide solace and structure. Participation becomes more personal, more inward-facing, and more reliant on local initiative. Information moves differently. News of distant events, invasions, political changes, military victories, or defeats arrive slowly. Rumors are filtered through traders, soldiers, or neighbors. Accuracy matters less than immediacy. You rely on observation and gossip to navigate reality. Decision-making becomes local, iterative, and pragmatic. Trust replaces formal authority. Where imperial systems fail to reach reliably, personal relationships and proven competence become the markers of influence. Patrons, landlords, and bishops increasingly provide security, enforcement, and mediation. Their authority is practical rather than legal, earned through action rather than codified in decrees. You adapt to this fragmented world quietly. Daily life continues, shaped not by central mandates but by observation, experience, and negotiation. You measure safety, prosperity, and community stability not by official reports, but by what actually works. You accept uncertainty as part of normal existence rather than as anomaly. And yet this adaptation has consequences. It narrows horizons. Dependence on local networks reduces mobility. Expectations shift from the imperial to the immediate. People start to internalize smaller scales of possibility, accepting what once would have seemed intolerable. The empire's presence, though still visible in law, coinage, and memory, becomes symbolic rather than operational. Its institutions persist, but they are increasingly unmoored from the realities of daily life. For you, life is neither dramatic nor catastrophic. It is persistent, careful, adaptive, sometimes dull, often repetitive, but always quietly meaningful. Survival, not ideology, guides choices. Stability is redefined as what can be maintained with the resources and relationships immediately at hand. And as the years stretch on, a thought begins to linger at the edges of your consciousness. If daily life can be sustained by adaptation alone, without central authority fully present, then what does it mean for an empire to endure, and what does it mean for it to end? You may not notice it immediately, but the daily rhythms of Roman life have changed permanently, not through catastrophe or invasion, but through subtle shifts in expectations, routines, and relationships. Stability no longer comes as a gift from the imperial center. It is something you construct, day by day, alongside neighbors, family, and local authorities. The streets, still familiar, now host a different kind of order. Vendors arrive reliably, but their inventories reflect local realities more than distant markets. Goods move, but not as predictably. You learn to anticipate shortages, adjust plans, and negotiate solutions quietly. Bureaucracy exists, but its delays and gaps mean that personal networks often matter more than official mandates. The forum, once the heart of civic life, remains active but transformed. Councils meet, but decisions are influenced heavily by immediate circumstances rather than distant law. Magistrates enforce rules selectively. Officials rely on persuasion, custom, and compromise. Justice is administered but unevenly. What matters is practical resolution, not consistency. Your household has become both refuge and hub. Extended families consolidate resources. Skills and trades are passed along informally. Children are educated in practicality first, literacy second, survival always. Dependence on external authority diminishes. Autonomy and local cooperation become central to survival. Religion now structures public and private life in ways it never did before. Christian clergy act as mediators, protectors, and providers. Temples and churches define spaces for community engagement, teaching, and social order. Pagan traditions linger quietly, but the shift toward Christian moral and social norms becomes increasingly visible. Religious ritual functions both as spiritual guidance and as practical social organization. Life for the soldier, artisan, or farmer is no longer measured by imperial promise, but by immediate effectiveness. Soldiers protect settlements, enforce agreements, and mediate disputes. Artisans adapt to local demand and resource availability. Farmers hedge against environmental and economic uncertainty. Everyone learns to operate within a network of interdependent survival strategies, rather than waiting for direction from afar. In this reconfigured daily life, authority is relational rather than hierarchical. The emperor exists in memory and on coinage, but influence is most tangible in the person who can act, defend, and resolve problems here and now. Patrons, landowners, bishops, and local commanders become the real arbiters of order. Empire exists as a backdrop, as a language, as tradition, but daily life flows around it rather than beneath it. This is continuity within change. Despite weakening central authority, life persists. Fields are planted and harvested. Goods circulate. Disputes are settled. Children are raised in knowledge and skill. Communities endure because they are adaptive, not because they remain strictly Roman in structure or governance. Stability has become something emergent rather than imposed. This persistence carries a subtle lesson. Empires are not defined solely by the presence of authority, armies, or legislation. They are also defined by the habits, practices, and memories that survive within the people who once depended on them. The Western Roman Empire fades not with a bang, but with the slow realignment of everyday life around new realities. And as you live through these adjustments, there is a quiet, unsettling realization. The endurance of daily life does not require the empire itself. People, practices, and communities adapt, sustain themselves, and carry forward many of Rome's legacies without needing imperial oversight. The empire may fall in theory, but life continues in ways that are meaningful, organized, and recognizable. By the time historians look back, they will describe decline and collapse. From your position, however, you experience continuity, adaptation, and survival. The empire's institutions may be weakened or abandoned, but the patterns of life, the routines, and the structures of memory endure. And the question remains, lingering in quiet reflection as you tend your fields, manage your household, or supervise your trades. If daily life can be sustained and adapted without central authority, then is the end of an empire truly a collapse, or merely a transformation that those living it barely notice? Story 5. The vanishing taxpayer economics of a fading empire. You wake to the sound of coins clinking in the hands of a tax collector, though the weight they carry is far less than it once was. The Western Roman Empire still expects tribute, but the numbers have changed. People have moved, died, or stopped paying. Land has been abandoned or consolidated under powerful patrons. The machinery of taxation, once smooth, predictable, and oppressive in its efficiency, now creaks under the strain of a shrinking base. In theory, taxation still functions as it always has. Officials count property, record debts, and send requests for payment. Assessors measure land and calculate expected grain, livestock, or coin contributions. Census rolls exist on paper. Ledgers are maintained meticulously, but these records increasingly misalign with reality. Fields lie fallow. Towns are depopulated. Wealth hides where it can, beneath the notice of inspectors or behind connections. You notice the small discrepancies first. A neighbor claims fewer acres than you know he farms. Another promises to pay later, citing harvest failure or illness. Officials nod, record the promise, and move on. They cannot afford conflict. Enforcement is expensive, slow, and uncertain. Rome's economy is no longer a single, well-oiled machine. It is a patchwork of regional practices, localized agreements, and improvisation. Some regions still send regular tribute. Others barely pay at all. The imperial treasury struggles to reconcile what is written with what actually exists. Official reports proudly display numbers that appear comprehensive, but field reality tells a different story. Commerce, too, changes under this strain. Trade routes are less secure and the cost of transport increases. Merchants rely more on personal connections and less on imperial protection. Markets shrink. Local production becomes central. Imported goods, spices, wine, silk arrive sporadically, often in diminished quantities or at inflated prices. Luxury becomes increasingly rare, a privilege rather than expectation. Your daily life revolves around adaptation. If you are a farmer, you hedge risk by storing surplus, negotiating with neighbors, and cultivating relationships with landowners or military units who can offer protection. Payment of taxes is strategic. Prioritize what is enforced and defer what is not. Survival depends on attention to local power structures as much as natural cycles. If you are a townsperson, you witness officials attempting to reconcile decrees with reality. Appeals are made, exceptions are recorded, and loyalty becomes transactional. People comply when necessary, resist quietly when possible, and adapt constantly. Wealth, labor, and food move less according to imperial design than according to social negotiation. The vanishing taxpayer is not a revolutionary. He is an ordinary person responding to ordinary pressures. He moves, he conceals, he barters, and he negotiates survival. Over decades, these behaviors accumulate. The state loses leverage slowly, imperceptibly. What seems minor at one moment, a delayed payment here, a hidden acre there, becomes structural weakness over time. Rome responds not with radical reform but with intensification. Laws are made stricter. Fines are increased. Offices are created to monitor and collect. Yet these measures rarely succeed as intended. Enforcement requires manpower and resources the empire can no longer provide reliably. Attempts to tighten control often push more taxpayers to conceal, evade, or relocate. The economic landscape becomes uneven. Some regions flourish under competent local administration and abundant resources. Others stagnate. Some people prosper by finding niches in a fragmented system. Others struggle under compounded scarcity, inconsistent oversight, and the erosion of centralized support. Inflation, debasement of coinage, and inconsistent wages exacerbate the problem. Currency loses reliability. Transactions increasingly rely on barter, kind, or localized tokens. Trust replaces standardization. The concept of a unified economic system, once central to Roman identity, begins to fray. The social consequences are profound. Wealth consolidates. Land becomes concentrated in fewer hands. Patrons grow in influence, offering protection and services in exchange for labor and loyalty. Peasants and smaller landowners become dependent on these patrons, reducing their interaction with the state itself. The empire exists more as a distant guarantor of authority than as a tangible economic partner. From your perspective, life continues. You work, you trade, you plan. You pay what you must, hide what you can, and negotiate what is in between. The system is no longer a single, predictable machine. It is a web of relationships, expectations, and compromises. Economic survival becomes a local game of adaptation, not an imperial mandate. And yet, the empire endures in record books and ledgers, even as reality drifts beneath them. Coins still bear the emperor's image. Decrees still call for taxes. Officials still send letters demanding payment. But the gaps between expectation and practice grow. The vanishing taxpayer is not gone by choice alone. He is absent because the empire cannot compel him consistently, and life continues anyway. The quiet erosion is cumulative, slow, and often invisible. One missed levy here, one hidden acre there, one barter in place of coin. Each small act contributes to the larger shift in the empire's power. Fiscal authority diminishes, not in dramatic collapse, but in the daily pragmatism of ordinary people. And the question that quietly arises as you observe this subtle unraveling is stark, almost philosophical. If an empire cannot enforce its economic rules but daily life continues, is it still a state, or has it become a memory wrapped in coins and paper? You begin to notice the gap between imperial expectation and local reality widening every year. The treasury issues proclamations, quotas for grain, coin, and labor, instructions for collection, fines for delinquency. The rhetoric remains formal, almost ceremonial. Ledgers are filled with figures that appear comprehensive. Reports are sent to the court, stamped and sealed, projecting an image of control. Yet in practice, the voice of the treasury grows fainter. Collectors travel from town to town, often without guards, bearing authority that feels fragile. Farmers and merchants greet them politely, sometimes pay partially, sometimes negotiate deferments. Occasionally they quietly withhold what they cannot spare. Patrons intervene, shielding their dependents from imperial demands. The empire's reach, once considered absolute, is now a suggestion. You notice how often written law conflicts with survival. A farmer cannot deliver the full grain quota during a drought. A merchant cannot produce coin that does not exist. Officials recognize these realities, but enforcement is difficult. Punishment is slow and uneven, and often more costly than the loss itself. So they bend, defer, or ignore. The ledger remains clean, but the real numbers tell a different story. Currency itself becomes unreliable. Debasement, inflation, and regional variation complicate transactions. Bronze and silver coins fluctuate in value. Merchants price goods not by imperial standard, but by local consensus, trust, and availability. Barter becomes increasingly common. Wealth measured in gold, silver, or coin loses meaning when grain, tools, or manpower define actual survival. From the imperial perspective, these adaptations are dangerous. Revenue is unpredictable. Supply chains falter. Military provisioning suffers. Official planning becomes increasingly speculative. The state projects strength on paper, but the reality on the ground diverges. From your perspective, life continues with a new pragmatism. You observe neighbors adjusting payments, pooling resources, and negotiating obligations. You participate in informal networks of trade and credit. You plan around delayed levies, missing coinage, and inconsistent enforcement. You trust relationships more than decrees. The economy is no longer a system imposed from above. It is something constructed locally, negotiated daily, and maintained through adaptability. Patrons and local strongmen emerge as critical intermediaries. They offer protection, mediate disputes, and sometimes collect tribute themselves. In exchange, they gain loyalty and labor. The empire tolerates these arrangements because it cannot enforce full compliance. Over time, these localized networks take over roles once reserved for imperial administration. The state's economic authority becomes contingent, dependent on intermediaries who bridge the gap between written law and lived reality. These adjustments have broader consequences. Consolidation of land and power creates social hierarchies more rigid than before. Smaller farmers are increasingly dependent on patrons. Communities rely on local leaders for enforcement, security, and conflict resolution. Civic identity shifts from allegiance to Rome toward allegiance to those who can act effectively in the immediate environment. Even trade routes, once patrolled and regulated by the state, now rely on personal connections. Merchants hire guides, rely on trusted contacts, and negotiate protection with local officials or landowners. Payment to the treasury becomes conditional, negotiated, or deferred. Imperial authority exists more in rhetoric than in practical effect. From the treasury's viewpoint, this is decline. From the everyday perspective, it is adaptation. Life continues, commodities circulate, markets function albeit irregularly, and communities endure. The empire, in theory, is still wealthy and powerful. In practice, it functions unevenly. Taxation exists as an idea, not a guarantee. And yet subtle tension remains. Officials know the gaps between expectation and practice. Patrons know their leverage. Citizens understand their options. The system teeters between order and disorder, but daily life persists. Survival depends not on obedience alone, but on negotiation, foresight, and relationships. The vanishing taxpayer is not a rebel. He is simply responding to incentives, scarcity, and opportunity. Each avoided levy, each delayed payment, each barter transaction adds up over decades. What seems like a small act of pragmatism contributes to a structural transformation in the empire's economy. As this pattern continues, the empire survives on paper, but its fiscal authority gradually diminishes. Administrative formalities persist. Currency bears the emperor's face. Tax rolls exist. Yet in practice, daily transactions bypass central control. Local power, adaptation, and trust shape economic life more than imperial mandates. The realization settles quietly in your mind. If taxes can no longer bind the population and commerce functions without strict enforcement, what is left of imperial power besides its memory and its coins? By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire's economic system has become a paradox. On paper, it is detailed, structured, and orderly. Ledgers enumerate land, grain, and coin with precision. Official reports boast figures that suggest stability and wealth. Collectors continue their rounds, stamps and seals in hand, projecting authority. In reality, the numbers no longer match the world they claim to measure. Land is abandoned or consolidated. Farmers and merchants adjust obligations to survive. Coin fluctuates in value. Bartering replaces strict monetary exchange. Revenue is delayed, diverted, or never realized. The empire maintains the illusion of control even as it loses the ability to enforce it consistently. You observe the subtle mechanics of this divergence. Collectors carry authority, but it is fragile. They negotiate, accept partial payment, or defer collection. They are skilled in diplomacy because force is costly and unreliable. Patrons intervene, shielding clients from the full weight of taxation. Communities comply where feasible and bend where necessary. Survival is pragmatic, not rebellious. The result is a system that functions because people choose to participate, not because the empire commands it. Local networks emerge as economic engines. Patrons administer lands, secure trade, and mediate disputes. Soldiers stationed nearby collect duties or escort merchants. Bishops and churches manage grain distribution or organize relief. The state becomes a backdrop, largely ceremonial, while daily transactions depend on these intermediaries. Currency retains symbolic power. Coins still carry the emperor's face, but value is contextual. Bronze, silver, and gold fluctuate. Barter dominates in areas where coin is scarce. Trust, reputation, and personal relationships govern trade. Economic continuity depends more on social bonds than on imperial edicts. This decentralization has consequences beyond the ledger. Wealth consolidates under patrons who can enforce loyalty. Smaller farmers, artisans, and traders adjust to dependencies on local power. Civic identity shifts. Allegiance to Rome exists in memory and ritual, while practical authority resides with those who can act immediately. The empire is present in stories, laws, and coins, but its function is increasingly symbolic. Yet life continues, communities adapt, commerce moves, fields are tilled, markets operate, and agreements are honored. Survival, not bureaucracy, shapes economic decisions. The Western Roman Empire endures, in essence, as a network of expectations, habits, and negotiated authority. Its decline is not dramatic or violent, but gradual and cumulative. The vanishing taxpayer illustrates the quiet erosion of fiscal control. Small acts of pragmatism accumulate into systemic change. The empire survives on paper, even as reality drifts beyond its grasp. From your perspective, life is neither chaotic nor catastrophic. It is organized, adaptive, and sustained, yet the underlying authority has shifted. The emperor's edicts, the treasury's counts, and the collector's presence matter less than relationships, negotiation, and local enforcement. And as you reckon with this transformation, one thought lingers quietly, almost imperceptibly. If people can live, trade, and survive without fully submitting to imperial authority, then perhaps an empire's endurance exists more in perception than in practice, and its end is not a collapse, but a quiet redefinition of who and what holds power. Story 6. Disease, death, and the slow thinning of populations. You wake to a world that has grown smaller without your noticing. The streets feel emptier, markets are less crowded, children play in clusters rather than in swarms. And you know why. Sickness is no longer an extraordinary event. It has become ordinary. Epidemics have a rhythm now. They pass through towns with measured cruelty, taking some, sparing others, and leaving survivors to rebuild as best they can. The empire once assumed control over life and death, believing that its organization, roads, armies, markets, and bureaucracy could contain disaster. By the 5th century, this belief is tenuous. Disease exploits gaps in infrastructure, overpopulated cities, and the constant movement of people. You learn the patterns of illness almost as you learn the seasons. Fevers come first, followed by swelling and fatigue. Some succumb quickly, others linger, surviving with weakness. Families prepare quietly, more firewood, extra water, preserved food. Homes are cleaned, herbs gathered, prayers offered. Survival depends on observation, experience, and a kind of luck that no official can guarantee. The empire attempts to respond. Officials record outbreaks, issue instructions, and sometimes mobilize aid. Hospitals, public baths, and physicians exist, but resources are thin, doctors are few, and response is slow. Quarantine measures are inconsistently enforced. Imperial decrees arrive late, if at all. You learn quickly that the formal system matters less than what you can do within your own household and community. Social life shifts in response. Markets and gatherings are less predictable. Travel is more cautious. Families consolidate to care for the ill and prevent further spread. Communities develop informal rules about who enters and who stays out, who helps and who watches. You participate in these decisions, quietly shaping your own survival alongside neighbors, knowing that centralized authority is too distant to intervene effectively. Mortality is high enough to alter daily calculations, yet low enough that life continues. Villages are repopulated by those who survive, often consolidating land and resources. Farms once abandoned by lost families are claimed by neighbors. Trade patterns shift subtly. Population thinning is gradual, cumulative, and persistent. The empire counts lives on paper, but on the ground, survival is determined by resilience, adaptation, and local care networks. Religion increasingly mediates the experience of illness and death. Christian clergy visit the sick, administer care, and offer solace. Funerary rituals become crucial social markers, reinforcing community bonds and shared memory. Temples and shrines serve as both spiritual and practical centers, places to gather, distribute food, and learn of local outbreaks. Pagan rituals continue in some regions, but Christian structures dominate public response. You notice the psychological toll. People live with an awareness of mortality that is pervasive but normalized. Fear is never absent, but it is balanced by routine and preparation. The dead are mourned, remembered, and replaced in social and economic functions by those who survive. Life continues not because the empire protects it, but because communities adapt continuously to its fragility. Trade and production adjust subtly. Artisans, farmers, and merchants factor mortality into their planning. Labor shortages influence harvests, construction, and craft. Contracts, wages, and prices reflect the uncertainty that illness imposes. Yet economic and social life persists. Adaptation becomes the dominant strategy for survival in a world where the state cannot guarantee continuity. The empire's population is declining, but this decline is uneven. Some regions retain density and resilience. Others are depopulated, their towns reduced to ruins or memories. In every case, local survival relies less on imperial presence and more on practical knowledge, social cohesion, and the ability to anticipate illness. And as you adjust to this reality, a subtle, uneasy thought forms. If death has become ordinary, and the empire cannot shield its people from disease, what remains of the illusion of imperial protection? And what does survival teach about the true strength of a society? Life after repeated waves of disease becomes a study in adaptation. You begin to notice that daily routines shift imperceptibly as households, towns, and villages reorganize to survive. The empire no longer guarantees security against illness. Roads and markets still exist, but they are no longer conduits of predictable movement. They become potential vectors of disease. Travel is undertaken cautiously, and gatherings are smaller and more localized. Families consolidate. Extended households, once a matter of tradition, now serve practical purposes. The sick are cared for in proximity. Labor shortages are mitigated by pooling resources. Children learn the rhythms of survival alongside work, tending fields, fetching water, observing neighbors. Knowledge of illness herbs, quarantine practices, hygiene becomes crucial to continuity. Daily life carries an undercurrent of calculation, not panic, but awareness that the unexpected can strike at any moment. Communities develop informal hierarchies centered on knowledge and reliability. The elders and healers command respect because experience now equates to survival. Those who can secure food, tend the sick, or maintain social cohesion emerge as critical figures. Priests and bishops occupy similar positions, combining spiritual authority with practical support, administering food aid, mediating disputes, and offering care to the sick. Religious institutions become both a buffer against death and a framework for social organization. Economic activity adjusts as mortality reshapes labor. Fields are planted and harvested with fewer hands. Artisans and merchants must account for the absence or delay of labor. Markets are smaller, goods arrive sporadically, and prices fluctuate unpredictably. People rely increasingly on barter, local networks, and reciprocal arrangements. Imperial systems, from tax collection to trade regulation, are inconsistent. Survival depends on observation, negotiation, and flexibility. Migration occurs quietly. Families relocate to more secure or fertile areas. Soldiers and displaced populations integrate into new communities, bringing labor and knowledge but also disease. Towns experience both shrinkage and renewal as old populations die or move, and newcomers settle. Continuity exists alongside disruption, creating a patchwork of stability and fragility across the empire. Psychologically, this era conditions people to live with mortality at the edges of consciousness. Fear is normalized but tempered by practical action. Families and communities internalize strategies for prevention, care, and contingency. Habits, routines, and relationships replace the absent authority of the state. What the empire cannot provide, health, predictability, protection, communities supply themselves. Resilience becomes localized and relational. Yet the empire's bureaucracy persists. Census reports, tax assessments, and administrative correspondence continue, producing a paper trail that masks reality. Officials record population numbers and levies, often unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the impact of disease. On paper, the empire appears unchanged. On the ground, daily life is a negotiation between scarcity, risk, and survival. The dissonance between imperial records and lived reality widens over time. Interestingly, this pressure cultivates unexpected opportunities. Survivors inherit land or skills, consolidate small properties, and develop new economic practices. Artisans innovate to account for shortages. Farmers adapt crop choices and methods. Local markets reorganize to function efficiently with fewer participants. Disease thins the population, but the survivors become more resourceful, resilient, and intimately connected to local networks. Adaptation emerges as the defining characteristic of society. From your perspective, ordinary days are no longer purely predictable. Life continues, but it is punctuated by the awareness of fragility. Illness and death are persistent companions, influencing decisions both small and large. You begin to understand the empire as a framework for memory, ritual, and law, rather than as a practical shield against misfortune. People live within its shadow, relying on local authority and social networks to negotiate reality. And as you navigate the uncertainties of everyday life, a question emerges quietly, almost imperceptibly, shaping your perception of continuity and collapse. If communities can sustain themselves through local knowledge and mutual support despite repeated waves of disease, then what role does an empire truly play in preserving life? And what, if anything, can it claim when survival has shifted into human hands? By now you live in a world where mortality is both ordinary and extraordinary. Death is constant, yet not omnipresent. Life continues in the spaces between losses, in the rhythms of work, family, and community. People wake, tend their fields, prepare meals, maintain homes, and care for one another, all under the subtle awareness that the next epidemic or illness could strike unpredictably. The Western Roman Empire no longer guarantees protection from disease. Communities themselves have become the primary defense. Families remain central. Multi-generational households consolidate labor and resources. Children learn not only to read and write, but to observe, respond, and adapt. Knowledge of plants' hygiene and care is passed orally, embedded in daily tasks. The sick are tended in place. Survival is as much about preparation as treatment. Death is managed quietly, ritualized through funerals and memorials that reinforce social bonds. Communities function as networks of resilience. Elders, healers, and clergy are critical nodes. Those who can procure food, mediate disputes, or manage labor shortages wield influence far more effectively than distant governors or imperial officials. Religious institutions increasingly anchor society. Churches provide both spiritual guidance and practical support, administering aid, tending the sick, and mediating obligations. Life is communal, dependent on relationships and mutual assistance more than imperial decree. Economically, society adjusts to population thinning. Labor shortages alter production and distribution. Fields are cultivated selectively. Artisans adjust output to available hands. Markets shrink but continue to function through barter and trust-based exchanges. Imperial taxation persists in theory, but in practice, it is inconsistent. Local negotiation replaces enforcement. Survival requires adaptability, patience, and pragmatic decision-making. The economy survives not through central authority, but through flexible local arrangements. The empire remains present in memory and ritual. Census rolls, tax decrees, and coinage bear the emperor's image. Laws are recorded, offices staffed, bureaucratic processes maintained. Yet the authority of these instruments is increasingly symbolic. Reality on the ground is determined by local knowledge, relationships, and practical action. Survival is a negotiation, not a command. Population decline reshapes social hierarchies. Land consolidates under those capable of enforcing loyalty and protection. Patrons and local leaders gain influence as central authority diminishes. Ordinary people adjust expectations, placing trust in local figures rather than distant rulers. Civic identity gradually shifts from imperial allegiance to relational dependence and community resilience. Psychologically, life in this era teaches adaptation. People internalize mortality, understand scarcity, and anticipate disruption. They develop routines that buffer against unpredictability. Fear persists, but it is managed. Knowledge, relationships, and observation become more important than abstract authority or imperial promises. Communities endure, not because the empire protects them, but because they have learned to protect themselves. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire exists more as an idea than a mechanism for security or governance. Its presence is in tradition, ceremony, and symbolic authority. Daily life operates independently, sustained by human networks, adaptation, and resilience. Death and disease do not define society, the response to them does. Life continues, interwoven with loss, adaptation, and cautious expectation. And as you navigate this delicate balance, a quiet, reflective thought emerges, shaping your understanding of history and humanity. If life persists, communities adapt, and societies endure despite the absence of imperial protection, then perhaps the true measure of an empire is not its ability to shield people from death, but its legacy in the habits, resilience, and networks that survive in its wake. Story 7. The Reluctant Magistrate's Governance in a Fragmented Empire. You wake to a world where laws are written but not always enforced, decrees exist but may never reach you, and magistrates walk among the populace with authority that is as much suggestion as command. By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire has transformed governance from an absolute hierarchy into a network of negotiation, compromise, and local discretion. In theory, magistrates are powerful. They oversee courts, collect taxes, maintain order, and implement imperial decrees. They are symbols of Rome's enduring structure. Yet in practice, their power is limited. Resources are thin. Troops are scarce. Enforcement depends on personal relationships, the willingness of local elites to cooperate, and the practical realities of geography and communication. The role is as much about persuasion as it is about law. You notice the subtleties of their influence. A magistrate arrives in a town with a new edict, a tax adjustment, a regulation about trade, or a requirement for labor. He carries authority but also vulnerability. Compliance is often negotiated. Patrons intervene on behalf of their dependents. Citizens present practical objections: insufficient grain, family obligations, illness, or labor shortages. The magistrate records the complaints, allows deferrals, and leaves without exercising full authority. Enforcement exists more on paper than in practice. Administrative routines have become improvisational. Officials spend more time negotiating than commanding. Council meetings revolve around discussion rather than decree. Records are maintained meticulously, yet the data increasingly reflects aspiration rather than reality. Ledgers track revenue, population, and production, but they are often inaccurate. Laws are codified, yet gaps in enforcement render them suggestions rather than mandates. You live under a governance system that appears precise but functions fluidly, shaped by necessity rather than principle. The consequences of this fluidity reach into every corner of life. Citizens, merchants, and farmers navigate the limitations of formal authority. They follow rules when feasible but prioritize local obligations and practical survival. Loyalty shifts toward patrons, family heads, or religious leaders who can act effectively. Imperial law persists as a guiding framework, but day-to-day governance depends on negotiation, compromise, and mutual understanding. Magistrates themselves adapt. They cultivate relationships with local elites, attend religious festivals, and mediate disputes personally. They recognize that authority is most potent when exercised with tact. Harsh enforcement risks mutiny or noncompliance. Leniency can preserve influence. Governance becomes relational rather than hierarchical, transactional rather than absolute. A magistrate's success is measured not by obedience alone, but by his ability to maintain stability, even imperfectly. This informal approach has both strengths and weaknesses. Communities endure and function despite weakened imperial authority. Decisions are responsive to local needs. Flexibility allows adaptation to shortages, disease, and demographic change. Yet inconsistency is unavoidable. What is enforced in one town may be ignored in another. Citizens learn to negotiate, delay, or circumvent regulations. The empire's reach is fragmented, leaving gaps in power, equity, and predictability. You observe that law, once a pillar of Rome, is now a set of guidelines interpreted through human relationships. Legal codes exist, but their application depends on who wields authority and who listens. Magistrates enforce rules selectively, often influenced by local politics, personal ties, and practical constraints. Authority has become relational, contingent, and sometimes negotiable. And in this landscape of flexible governance, you begin to notice a subtle, unsettling truth. The empire still exists, but its structures now operate as networks of human behavior rather than rigid hierarchies. Compliance is voluntary, enforcement inconsistent, and loyalty situational. As you witness magistrates negotiating, mediating, and navigating daily realities, you cannot help but wonder. If authority becomes optional, and laws function more as guidelines than imperatives, what holds an empire together? And what happens when those who enforce it are as human as those they govern? By now, you understand that governance in the Western Roman Empire is no longer a matter of command, it is a constant negotiation. Magistrates and local officials carry the weight of Rome's authority, yet their effectiveness depends on relationships, reputation, and practical judgment rather than strict enforcement of law. Daily life unfolds in a delicate balance between imperial expectation and local reality. Officials still maintain records. Ledgers track taxes, census counts, and legal cases. Reports are sent to the imperial court, meticulously stamped and sealed. On paper, the empire appears structured, orderly, and cohesive. Yet on the ground, these documents are aspirational. Fields lie fallow, revenues are delayed, and disputes often bypass formal resolution. The records create the illusion of control, while actual authority has become flexible and situational. You see this in action in the courts. A dispute over land or property arises. The magistrate hears arguments, evaluates evidence, and issues a decision. Yet enforcement is limited. Local patrons or families may influence outcomes. Agreements are often negotiated rather than dictated. Justice exists, but it is contingent, fair and functional only insofar as it preserves peace, satisfies influential parties, and aligns with practical circumstances. Imperial law is cited, but local interpretation prevails. Tax collection illustrates the practical limits of authority even more clearly. Collectors arrive expecting coin, grain, or labor. Citizens comply when possible but negotiate deferments or partial payments when circumstances prevent full contribution. Patrons intervene on behalf of their dependents. Communities adapt, distributing obligations among households, pooling resources, or using barter to substitute for cash. The formal authority of the empire is present but fragile, relying on compliance that is voluntary, context-dependent, and negotiable. Daily governance is inseparable from social networks. Magistrates cultivate relationships with local elites, attending festivals, assisting in disputes, and mediating conflicts. Religious leaders often serve as intermediaries, providing both moral authority and practical support. Citizens weigh allegiance to Rome against the ability of local figures to act effectively. Compliance is a choice informed by risk, necessity, and trust rather than fear of punishment. Authority is relational, exercised in the space between law and reality. This negotiated system has advantages. Flexibility allows communities to respond to crises, harvest failures, epidemics, or military threats without waiting for distant directives. Local decision-making is pragmatic. Conflicts are often resolved before they escalate. Daily life continues with a surprising degree of stability, despite the weakening of formal imperial structures. Magistrates act as facilitators rather than absolute enforcers, preserving cohesion through persuasion, compromise, and personal influence. Yet the system is fragile. Inconsistent enforcement breeds inequality. Regions with competent, respected magistrates thrive. Those with weak or corrupt officials falter. Citizens learn to exploit gaps when convenient, undermining uniformity. Loyalty shifts toward local patrons and power brokers. Imperial law remains a reference, but its authority depends increasingly on social context rather than coercion. As you navigate this world, you notice subtle patterns emerging. Governance is less about hierarchy and more about negotiation. Authority is effective only when backed by social capital, knowledge, and adaptability. Compliance is flexible. Enforcement is relational. Law survives in form, but its function is mediated by practical necessity. The empire persists in memory, ritual, and documentation, while day-to-day governance is a tapestry of personal judgment and local arrangement. You start to see the deeper implication. The empire exists in fragments, held together not by absolute command, but by shared understanding, tacit agreements, and human relationships. Stability is maintained not through fear, punishment, or rigid law, but through continuous negotiation, trust, and adaptation. And in this careful balancing act, a question arises quietly but persistently. If authority is exercised through negotiation and compromise, and compliance is conditional, what truly defines an empire its laws, its offices, or the willingness of people to honor them when survival depends on adaptation? By the 5th century, you live in a world where law exists, yet enforcement is flexible, decrees exist, yet compliance depends on negotiation. Magistrates exist, yet their authority is contingent. Governance is no longer a rigid hierarchy imposed from above. Instead, it has become a network of human relationships, local influence, and pragmatic adaptation. Magistrates still travel the roads, visit towns, and carry the symbols of Rome's authority. They oversee courts, collect taxes, and maintain records. Yet the reality of their power is situational. They rely on persuasion, alliances with patrons, and mediation through religious and community leaders. Their authority functions because people recognize its utility, not because they fear it. Enforcement is selective, negotiation is constant, and discretion is essential. Daily life illustrates this network. In courts, decisions are tempered by local influence. Patrons, families, and clergy intervene to sway outcomes. Justice is practical rather than absolute. Outside the courtroom, officials adjust expectations based on local conditions: harvest yields, labor availability, disease outbreaks, or social tensions. Imperial law is cited, but its application is flexible. Citizens comply when feasible, negotiate when necessary, and resist subtly when convenient. Survival dictates behavior more than imperial decree. Tax collection continues as a prime example. Officials arrive expecting tribute, but households pay what they can. Patrons mediate obligations, communities pool resources, and barter supplements coinage. The state's economic authority is increasingly symbolic, while local enforcement and negotiation determine practical outcomes. Over time, tax compliance becomes relational rather than compulsory, dependent on trust, reputation, and immediate enforcement capacity. Religious leaders increasingly bridge gaps in governance. Bishops and priests mediate disputes, distribute aid, and coordinate local resources. Their moral authority often carries more weight than that of distant magistrates. Communities rely on clergy for guidance, social cohesion, and practical assistance. The empire's legal structures survive in theory, but the moral and operational authority shifts to those present in daily life. Governance becomes embedded in human networks rather than maintained solely through offices or decrees. This network system has strengths. Flexibility allows adaptation to crises: epidemics, famines, invasions, and labor shortages. Communities respond quickly because decision-making is local. Relationships ensure continuity, even when distant authority falters. Stability emerges through negotiation, trust, and shared experience rather than coercion. People continue to work, trade, and live within a framework of predictable social norms, even as imperial oversight diminishes. Yet it is fragile. Inequality persists where influential patrons dominate. Enforcement varies widely, producing local discrepancies. Imperial law exists more as a guiding reference than a practical tool. Citizens learn to navigate gaps, exploiting inconsistencies when necessary. Authority is conditional, context-dependent, and relational. The empire, while present in ritual, memory, and bureaucracy, is increasingly disconnected from daily governance. As you observe this transformation, a subtle insight emerges. The essence of imperial authority is no longer in coercion, law, or bureaucracy, but in the network of people willing to uphold order, negotiate disputes, and maintain stability. Magistrates succeed not because they wield absolute power, but because they manage relationships effectively, leverage local influence, and adapt to circumstances. And so, as you participate in or witness this delicate balancing act, a quiet reflection takes hold. If governance survives through negotiation, trust, and relational authority, then perhaps an empire's strength lies less in its offices and laws, and more in the human networks that sustain its memory, influence, and cohesion, even as the central authority fades. Story 8. The Silent Frontier's Border Defense in Decline. You wake near the frontier, where the empire meets the unknown. Beyond the walls and fortifications, forests, rivers, and plains stretch into lands that are not Roman, or that are only nominally so. In earlier centuries, soldiers patrolled these borders diligently. Watchtowers scanned the horizon, and messages traveled swiftly along roads connecting the frontier to the imperial center. By the 5th century, this vigilance has diminished. What was once a controlled boundary is now a quiet, uneasy buffer. The soldiers you see are fewer in number, less trained, and often local. Many are recruited from nearby villages or towns rather than distant provinces. Their loyalty is partly to Rome, but mostly to the commander or patron who provides pay, food, and shelter. Discipline exists, but enforcement is inconsistent. Orders arrive late or not at all. The frontier endures more through human presence than through imperial organization. Fortifications stand as monuments to past certainty. Walls, ditches, and watchtowers remain, but maintenance is irregular. Some towers are abandoned, stones repurposed by local villagers, or the gates left to sag. Roads intended for rapid troop movement are eroded, overgrown, or blocked. Signals that once carried warnings from watchtower to watchtower now arrive only by luck, rumor, or the initiative of a local soldier. Yet life continues at the edge. Villagers, traders, and soldiers learn to anticipate danger and act preemptively. Patrols are irregular but persistent. Scouts move quietly along paths, reporting unusual activity. Local militias supplement official garrisons, drawn from communities invested in defending their homes. Trade continues cautiously, with caravans organized to minimize risk. Borders are porous, yet survival depends on knowledge of local terrain, networks, and timing. You observe that the frontier is now a zone of negotiation. Interactions with neighboring tribes or groups are often pragmatic rather than purely hostile. Some negotiate safe passage for trade. Others exchange gifts or tribute. Occasional skirmishes occur, but large-scale invasions are less common than small, opportunistic raids. Soldiers and villagers alike understand that diplomacy, observation, and strategic compromise often matter more than strength or numbers. Communication with the heart of the empire is slow. Requests for reinforcements, supplies, or instructions may take weeks or months to arrive. When they do, they may be outdated. Commanders must improvise. They rely on judgment, local alliances, and the cooperation of the population. Orders exist, but execution depends on human initiative and flexibility. The empire's theoretical reach exceeds its practical presence. Frontier life is marked by heightened awareness of mortality and scarcity. Illness, injury, and the consequences of conflict are constant risks. Supplies of food, weapons, and tools are irregular. Soldiers and civilians alike must improvise, adapt, and negotiate to survive. Life on the edge becomes self-reliant, practical, and relational. Communities depend on trust, mutual aid, and the shared understanding that the empire's authority is distant, symbolic, and sometimes ineffective. Over time, the frontier evolves from a line of defense into a zone of autonomy. Local garrisons, villages, and militias exercise de facto control over territory. Boundaries are defined not by imperial decree alone, but by negotiation, survival, and mutual understanding with neighbors, allies, and occasional adversaries. Rome exists as a distant reference, a source of coin, prestige, and occasional orders, but daily life on the edge is shaped by local conditions and practical decision-making. And as you watch the frontier endure quietly, without grand battles or dramatic heroics, a thought emerges. If the empire's borders are maintained more by local initiative and negotiation than by central authority, then what does it mean for an empire to exist? And what happens when its edge is more alive than its center? By now, you understand that frontier life is defined less by imperial command and more by adaptation, observation, and negotiation. Soldiers, villagers, and local leaders operate in a delicate balance between defense, trade, and survival. The empire's presence is felt in name, coin, and the occasional order, but the practical maintenance of security is a matter of local initiative. Daily routines are shaped by vigilance. Patrols move along irregular schedules, watching roads, rivers, and forests. Scouts are familiar faces, often drawn from local families who know the terrain and the patterns of neighboring groups. Villagers observe quietly from homes and fields, alert to changes in movement or rumor. Every action is measured, when to venture into the woods, when to send trade caravans, when to reinforce a gate or tower. Fortifications, once symbols of authority, now serve as tools of improvisation. Walls, towers, and ditches are partially maintained, often patched using locally available materials. Gatekeepers negotiate passage with travelers and merchants. Watchtowers double as storage, observation posts, and meeting spaces. The structures themselves are reminders of past certainty, yet their utility is practical rather than symbolic. Interactions with neighboring groups are nuanced and adaptive. Trade, negotiation, and tribute coexist with conflict. Local leaders establish agreements with nearby tribes or raiding parties. Safe passage in exchange for goods, labor, or gifts. Minor raids are tolerated if they serve local balance. Large-scale attacks are rare because communities anticipate and mitigate them. Diplomacy, observation, and flexibility are as critical as swords or walls. Supply chains are irregular but resilient. Grain, tools, weapons, and coin arrive inconsistently. Soldiers supplement supplies with local production or trade. Villagers adapt by storing food, sharing resources, and maintaining networks of trust. Survival depends on careful planning and collective effort rather than imperial provisioning. Even when distant commands arrive, they may be impossible to implement fully. Local judgment fills the gaps. The social structure of frontier communities reflects necessity. Leaders emerge based on competence, knowledge, and influence rather than official rank alone. Soldiers and militia leaders coordinate defense and patrols. Patrons and elders manage disputes, distribute resources, and negotiate with outsiders. Priests and clergy provide moral guidance, care for the sick, and maintain social cohesion. Authority is relational, contingent, and practical. Rome's presence is more an idea than a direct force. Life on the frontier shapes behavior, skill, and resilience. Children learn survival strategies alongside reading, writing, and craft. Farmers account for scarcity and risk in planting and harvesting. Artisans improvise production when materials are delayed or unavailable. Trade relies on reputation and trust. Every person understands that life here depends less on imperial oversight than on personal knowledge, observation, and negotiation. The frontier demonstrates a profound truth about human organization. Order emerges from necessity, not decree. Authority is exercised relationally. Boundaries exist because people recognize their utility, negotiate their enforcement, and respect local hierarchies. Rome's structures persist, but they operate in the background, largely ceremonial, while practical power rests with those present on the ground. And as you witness the quiet persistence of life along the empire's edges, a reflective thought takes shape. If survival at the border relies on local initiative, negotiation, and relational authority more than imperial power, then perhaps the true strength of an empire is found not at its center, but in the adaptability and resilience of those who guard its edges. By the time you fully settle into frontier life, it becomes clear that the borders of the Western Roman Empire have transformed into something almost independent. The edge is no longer simply a line to defend. It is a dynamic zone where survival, negotiation, and adaptation define the lives of soldiers, villagers, and local leaders. Imperial authority persists, but it exists more in memory, coin, and ritual than in daily practice. You notice that order is maintained not by law alone, but by practical relationships. Soldiers patrol with local guides, villagers coordinate watch rotations, and militia leaders make decisions based on terrain, weather, and rumor. The frontier's safety depends on knowledge, trust, and timing rather than on distant commands. Each action is calculated to preserve life, property, and resources. Fortifications continue to serve as hubs of coordination. Towers, gates, and walls, partially repaired and maintained by local hands, become centers of administration, storage, and communication. A single tower may serve as a lookout, a granary, a meeting hall, and a temporary court. Their function has shifted from imperial symbols to practical tools for community survival. Relations with neighboring tribes and groups are a daily exercise in diplomacy. Trade, tribute, and negotiation coexist with minor conflicts. Safe passage, seasonal trade, and agreements to avoid raiding are established through personal relationships and local mediation. Leaders must constantly weigh risk against benefit, balancing survival with political and economic opportunity. Violence exists, but it is rarely catastrophic. Prevention and negotiation are more effective than confrontation. Supply and trade networks adapt creatively. Food, coin, and materials arrive irregularly. Local production, bartering, and pooled resources are critical. Caravans travel cautiously, sometimes escorted by militias or volunteers. Delays and scarcity are normalized. Communities plan around them. The frontier economy is improvisational, resilient, and localized, thriving despite the absence of consistent imperial provision. Social hierarchies reflect competence and influence rather than rank alone. Soldiers, militia leaders, patrons, elders, and clergy command respect based on knowledge, effectiveness, and reliability. Communities recognize the authority of those who can act, defend, and mediate. Imperial officials exist in the background, more symbolic than functional. Daily governance, justice, and economic regulation emerge organically through the network of local actors. You begin to understand the frontier as a microcosm of the empire's larger transformation. Imperial power remains an idea, a distant framework, but the practical governance, security, and survival of the population rest on human networks, adaptability, and shared experience. The edges of the empire, once passive peripheries, now embody resilience, pragmatism, and relational authority. They survive because people engage with reality as it is, not as the empire prescribes it. As you live and work in this environment, you notice a subtle but profound truth. Life persists, order is maintained, and communities endure even where imperial authority is weak or absent. Stability does not require distant decrees. It requires observation, negotiation, and adaptive action. And as the sun sets over watchtowers and forested plains, you are left with a lingering reflection. If the frontier can sustain life, enforce agreements, and maintain order more effectively than the distant center, then perhaps the strength of an empire is not in its laws, armies, or bureaucracy, but in the adaptability, ingenuity, and resilience of those who inhabit its margins.